Ugla, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. It's great to have you join me for this little film series that we're making. Um, I guess that you and Fox are such brilliant role models for the community, and you've made some amazing films through my generation, which many of which I've referred to and many of which I've watched. So obviously it's so important that we've got this visibility, that we've got these positive role models for particularly young people, and seeing trans lives and possibilities now, whereas before perhaps they were more hidden. And of course, you know as well as I do that waiting times for the NHS are still very, very long. So here at the Welsh Gender Service, we wanted to make some films to try to reach out to particularly younger people wanting to get in touch with our service, to give them some things that they might take away as inspiration. And of course, you wrote a brilliant guide, the Trans Teen Survival Guide, which I absolutely love. And I recommend this to GPs and families if they get in touch and they'd like something to get hold of, to give people a bit of a steer and a bit of a guidance. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that book. And I'd like to start with the chapter on coming out, which is called Telling the World or Not. And I referenced this idea that it was the most liberating and life-saving thing that some people in the book have said they've ever done. But of course, you open this chapter by saying that saying those words, I'm trans, can be some of the hardest words to say. But when I look through it and people's accounts of that time, one of the things that really rings through for me is that idea of sticking to your truth. It really rings through. Silas said, all that matters is you are happy. You are not hurting anyone by being yourself. And Alex said, times are hard, but being true to yourself is the most precious gift you can give the world. So this concept of sticking to your truth, but also understanding the person being told is really critical. And I wondered if you could expand a bit about that for me.
Yeah, definitely. I think, coming out to everyone and anybody who has come out at some point in their life know that once you're sort of in the space of thinking, okay, I'm ready to tell someone, it's still like the most excruciating thing you can think of. And you think, everything's going to fall apart and the world is going to explode and everything's going to be really bad. And, you really hype it up to be this really difficult thing. And I definitely did that when I was coming out as trans. I thought it was going to be something that was going to, make my family dislike me, or they would disown me, they wouldn't understand. And when I did it, it was actually a lot less dramatic than I thought it would be. And I think for a lot of people, at least today, things are turning towards being a lot more positive than people expect. And people are often quite, pleasantly surprised by reactions from people when they come out. And I think, yeah, the element of sticking to your truth, I think, is so important, because there's so much stuff in the world right now, and so many people who are saying that trans people aren't this and trans people aren't that, and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. But you're doing this for yourself, and that's ultimately what you have to do. And you can't live your life for somebody else. So you have to stick to that truth and know who you are, and say, this is me. And there's loads of people that will support you regardless of what happens when you do. And I think, having those support networks is incredibly important, because sometimes it's not necessarily safe for everyone to come out. Sometimes it's a bit difficult. So having some sort of a support network is really, really important, just to make sure that you have someone to catch you once that happens. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's so nice to read some of the stories, because I think some of them will resonate. I mean, certainly when I came out, that was a long time ago. I came out as a lesbian when I was 16 years old. So that's, well, almost 3 decades ago now, a long, long time ago. And at the time, there were no role models. I had no idea what this language was. I didn't know what it was that I was supposed to say. I felt shame because I thought I was the only person in the world experiencing that. So, but having done so, I just remember this absolute feeling of complete, just relief, I think, for me personally. And it was hard, but there was no surprise. My mother was like, oh, I thought you were going to tell me something else, like she knew all along, actually, as it turned out. I thought I had this big secret, but it turned out I didn't. So, and of course, some people won't get that positive reaction. Some people may experience, particularly parents, thinking that this is a fad, particularly if you're a young person, the idea that, you know, that this is just a phase. And I love that idea that people in the book are so insightful and almost understand. They've accounted for the person that's being told as well, and given that person that space to sort of sit with it, because they've sat with it for so long and this is the first time.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important as well, right?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because I remember when I came out, you know, I'd been thinking about this for many, many years. When I finally came out, I was about 18. And when I came out, which was quite young at the time, it was over 10 years ago. So coming out at that time was very early at those times. And I think, you know, I wanted my parents to get it right away. And I was like, you should just understand it. It's not that difficult. You should just get it, you know. I just kind of I I felt like in hindsight, I didn't quite give them a space that maybe I should have given them, because for them, this was the first time they were ever hearing about anybody being trans, and let alone their own child being trans. So, you know, for them, it was a process of you know, having to digest that and having to think, well, okay, this child we've been raising for 18 years is telling us that there's someone completely different, even though obviously I'm still the same person. And there's just certain elements that I want to change about my outside, and you know, I'm still the same person on the inside. And I think that was something that my parents realized eventually, that I wasn't necessarily changing as a person. I was sort of more coming into my own, and I was, you know, becoming who I always was. And I think once they realized that they weren't necessarily losing something, but they were gaining something, that's when they really got on board. Because at the start they did really feel like they were losing, you know, I have two brothers, and all of a sudden, you know, they don't have three brothers. All of a sudden they're losing one of them. And, you know, for them, that was a process of grief, I think. And going through that was quite difficult for them. But then I think, you know, my mom especially really sort of came into her own with it. And she was really happy to finally have a girl, or someone, you know, she could relate to it in certain ways. And when I started growing my hair, she started growing her hair too. And it was an interesting sort of change that happened with them. Which I really, really loved. But I think I was quite I challenged them quite a lot to begin with, maybe a bit unfairly sometimes. So yeah, it's a process for everyone. I think there's never just one person that comes out. You know, it's their whole surroundings that also have to sort of get to grips with it, and that can sometimes take time and can be frustrating, for sure.
For sure. And I remember in the book you covered a story of a mum whose trans daughter came out, and she felt, because they'd come out on the telephone, she felt that she had to fly to go see her, which is amazing. And the mother describing this sense of grieving for their son, and then realization that they had a daughter and how wonderful it is. And
Yeah.
when I work in the service, I hear so many stories of people really flourishing after that point, and actually what parents see or siblings see is a child blossoming and happy, and fundamentally that coming round to being the most important thing.
Yeah.
But it is a big responsibility on the person to have to manage all of that. There's a section in the chapter around, you know, unsupportive family and friends, and how you might prepare yourself for that, because
Yeah.
it isn't always, you know, a fairy tale ending. For some
Yeah.
people it never happens, that affirmation never comes, which is extremely hard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's, you know, it's really difficult to know how to manage that, because you think that these people are your family and there's someone who's supposed to love you no matter what. And then when you tell them something so fundamental about yourself and they don't support it, that's really, really hurtful. But I think, you know, as we say in the book as well, there's always going to be people who will support you. And queer people have often had to choose their own family, you know, especially back in the day when things were even more rough and things were even more difficult, you know. And we've seen this in certain, you know, films and TV series where people come out and they might not have families. You know, there's always a chosen family. And I think most recently there was a show called It's a Sin, which talks about the AIDS crisis in the 80s in the UK and the 90s. And what sort of struck through, as you said, this this element of shame was really, really apparent in that series, and how that can really affect people. But these people still found a family even in that time, and they found people who loved them and supported them. And I think, even if things are rough and even if things are really difficult, there's always going to be people who will support you and will see you as exactly who you are.
I completely agree. It's very, very rare that we meet somebody at the point of their first appointment with us who hasn't got a family of some description. And family is a very all-encompassing broad word. So I think you're absolutely right about that. And it's so, so important to have that peer support and have that affirmation there and sticking to your truth. Thank you. That's great. I wanted to move on to chapter 2 because I actually have to say I love the headings of all your chapters. They're absolutely brilliant. But gender roles are dead. This kind of this statement that you kind of made as a chapter name, which I love. And also chapter 5, kind of talking about being you and kind of doing you, I guess, as well. And around this concept that your worth isn't measured by how well you pass as a girl or boy. And this struggle that we're having at the moment in the UK around sort of gender stereotypes and this issue of cisnormativity, the assumption that everyone is cisgender, and how much work is being done to really smash that gender binary, but how so often even trans people get caught up in feeling that they have to conform to a certain stereotype in order to be accepted or to pass, to be a welcome part of society. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, regardless of whether people are trans or cis, we all have these experiences of gender where something is expected of us, and we are expected to behave a certain way, dress a certain way, like certain things. And, we've all been acquainted with gender stereotypes. It's not necessarily something someone has taught us or said explicitly. It's just something that appears in society, in the way people phrase things, in the way people group people, or the way people look at people when they do certain things. And we all sort of know these rules, kind of. We all know that, oh, if we do this, then people will react in a certain way. And I think for trans people, this is, really difficult to navigate, because as a trans person, you're trying to come out and be yourself. And the signifiers in society are, this is a man, this is a woman, this is what they do, this is how they dress. So when trans people sort of come out, they think, well, I have to conform to these things because otherwise people are going to think that I am less of a woman, or I'm not a real woman, or I'm not a real man. But then when trans people actually too conform to those gender stereotypes, they're also criticized for enforcing stereotypes. And it's almost like you're caught in you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Because if you don't conform, then obviously society will respond to you in a very certain way. And that's why, my philosophy has always been that we shouldn't be anything but ourselves, whatever that might mean. And we should always dress or be or express ourselves in the most comfortable way that feels for us. And we have to stop thinking about what other people think of us. Obviously it can be difficult, because if you're a trans person that's visibly trans in society, people will respond to you in certain ways. But at the same time, you just really have to be yourself, because you are here to be yourself, and you're here to live your truth, and you're here to express yourself how you feel comfortable. So, we will make change in society the more people are allowed to be themselves. So the more people that express that, the easier it's going to become. It's not always easy, but I think when I first came out, for example, I was really concerned about how I was going to look and how I was going to present, and then what I, needed to do to access healthcare. And I felt I had to conform to very specific stereotypes. But as it got along, I sort of realized that wasn't truly who I was. So I kind of went from everybody boxing me as a boy, saying I should be a certain way, into everybody boxing me into being a woman, a very certain type of woman. And I sort of felt like, well, I'm not doing this for other people. I just really have to be who I am. And that's when I started to break free of those stereotypes and saying, well, actually, for me, my gender identity is a bit more complex than just, your typical woman. And for me, non-binary sort of feels comfortable as well. And, my gender identity just doesn't really fit in any of these categories, and that's okay. and my expression is quite feminine, and that just feels really comfortable to me. So I think people just need to find what works for them, because that's the most important thing, and forget all of those gender roles. That phrase, gender roles are dead, is a phrase that Fox came up with many, many years ago, and made a screen print of it, and then printed it onto t-shirts and stuff. And it's really just, it's kind of it's kind of an ode to, war is over. Even though we know that war isn't over, the sentiment is that war shouldn't exist. And that's sort of the idea about gender roles are dead. Of course, gender roles do exist and they do affect people, but they shouldn't, and we shouldn't have to conform to them. So, it's an idea that we can break free from them if that's what we truly want, and we shouldn't be confined by them.
Yeah, and I said this to when I was speaking with Juno. I'm so grateful to the community for pushing that, because I don't think that gender stereotypes help
Mm,
myself as a gender non-conforming cis
mm,
person either.
mm,
And it's really helped me to break free of those expectations as well. So it's not just, it doesn't just benefit trans people to do them and be unapologetically them.
yeah.
I think it also benefits wider society. And I think you're right, there is a war at the moment, but I think if you get this response, it means that something's happening. It means that you're being effective in some ways, and
Mm,
it's a tough thing to push through, but it means that things are stirring, I guess. And it's I love that you've done so much work around this, in your filmmaking, both of you, and I think it's so helpful, particularly now for young people who understand gender and possibilities
mm,
in such a different way to my generation.
mm,
Not the concept of non-binary was just not there. I can't remember anything
mm,
being there in terms of visibility, and it's there now, and
mm.
it's being worked through, and I love that. I love to see that coming out. So thank you. And I guess one key part of everybody's identity is their name, and a name and pronouns are so central to people. They're so significant, they're so important, and even across all cultures across the world, some names have meanings, and selecting a name and pronouns, you said, is are some of the most important things that you can do as a person, kind of establishing yourself and your identity. And of course, some people love and embrace their birth name, and that's completely fine. And I think there's this misconception that gender clinics ask people to make a legal change of name. But of course, if that's your birth name, and if that's the name that you resonate with, then of course that's important. It should be celebrated. You've got a wonderful name, and I'd love you to tell me a bit more about it. Was it your given name, or is this your chosen one?
It's my chosen one. Ugla is means owl in Icelandic, and in Iceland we have a lot of names that mean something. Like either it's a name for an animal, or a name for something in nature, or something related to that. So we have very sort of poetic names, I think, and there are books which tell you the explanations of every single name there is in Icelandic, which is quite good. But when I was born, my brothers and I were all given names which mean something, which is a bird, a type of bird. So when I came out and I was choosing a new name, I was like, well, my parents did this tradition of having only bird names. So I kind of have to stick to that, because I feel like I can't just completely ruin the whole thing, because I thought it was quite cool. And I just realized, well, okay, there are lots of, feminine bird names. And I went with a bunch of friends, and we sort of took a book that had bird names and birds in them. And we sort of looked through it, and we thought, well, okay, what names would fit? And we sort of digested a few different names, and I was kind of like, well, okay, none of them really fit, and it's all a bit, it doesn't quite fit me. And then someone said Ugla, and in Icelandic it's not a very common name, so it's quite a unique name. And when I first heard it, I was like, well, it's a bit strange, it's a bit, out there, no one really has that name, and I didn't really resonate with it at first. And then we didn't really come to a conclusion. So my friends just sort of, as a joke, started calling me Ugla. And they were like, well, why don't we just call you Ugla? We can just use that. And after a few weeks of digesting it, I was kind of like, well, actually, this name fits really well. And I really like it now. And it's really unique. And it really is a bit of a statement, I think. So I ended up choosing it, and now I love it. So, it's a bit of a bit of a journey. And then my second name, Stefania, is also it's just the feminine version of my old middle name, and my middle name was in reference to my grandpa. So I sort of kept the same tradition there, and I did this in I talked to my mom and my dad, and I said, well, what do you think about these names? Does that fit? And we sort of came to this together. But I ultimately said to them, well, ultimately the decision is mine, but I'm really happy for you to have a say in it, and have a think about what you think would be good, because I thought it was nice to include them in a way, and make it like, and I thought that was a nice way of including them in the whole process as well, and then they felt like they were a part of it. And that sort of, I think, really helped them as well come to terms with things, because they felt like they had a say in these things. Because I think for parents, naming your child is a really big thing, and being a part of something like that really helped them sort of process the whole thing. And yeah, so I think it's really important to try to have these things. But of course, people can choose whatever name they want, and they don't have to do it in conjunction with anyone else. And one thing I actually saw online recently was that not only trans people can change their name, like anybody can change their name, and it can be a really fun process to go through. And you really can have that power of choosing your name. And I think for us as people, as you said, names are so important, because it's such a signifier of who we are, and what we respond to. So I think names, and especially pronouns as well, are just a really, really fundamental part of who we are and how other people see us. So when we change our pronouns, and when somebody uses that pronoun, it means that they're recognizing you fundamentally as something that you really are. And I think people don't understand the significance of that sometimes. Because to them it's just a pronoun, and they've always had a certain pronoun that just fits them, and they don't think about it. But for trans people, it's such an important and a fundamental part of who you are. So if people choose a new pronoun, then doing so is just such a great big thing. And I think anybody who has just knows the euphoria of experiencing that when somebody uses the right name or the right pronoun. But as you said, some people don't necessarily change their names and pronouns, and that's completely fine as well. It's just about finding what fits you. And sometimes you can try things out, try things out with your friends, or ask your family to try this. And, nothing is set in stone. You can always change things later on, or find something that fits even better. And, it's a journey. It's not something you have to decide fully on this day. This is going to happen, and it's never going to change.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember one particular person in the service quite clearly. I met up with them again, and they said, "Oh, by the way, Doc, I've got a new name." And I was like, "Great, what is it?" And they it was a similar thing. They'd sat with one name, had a go, and it worked okay. Their friends had helped them pick one, and there was something that just wasn't quite right, didn't quite resonate with them, and they went back to their mom and they had a conversation and said, what were you thinking around boys' names for me, when I was born, when you were preparing? And mum gave them some names, and there was one out of those few that really worked for them. And of course, names are important, and it's not just specific to trans people. People take on, some people take on their husband's surname, for example, when they marry. Not everybody, but some people do. And a lot of doctors, so myself as a doctor, I didn't want to take anyone else's surname if and when I married, because I wanted, my name was always Dr. Quinney, and it resonated with me, and I didn't want to have a different surname. So we all experience that, and I think it's helpful to reflect on our own experiences of name change and realize just how fundamentally important that is. I always wondered about Fox as well, whether Al met Fox, or Fox became Fox after they met Al. So
Yeah. We became so separately. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. When we met, I met Fox. I was like, well, my name is Ugla, and that means owl, and that's actually quite interesting. And then when we got together, we were sort of like, well, wouldn't it be cute to like have Fox and owl and stuff? So it became I just translated it to English because that's what it means. So it was a really, really interesting coincidence in how it came together. But, yeah.
No, I love that, and you're so well known as Fox and Owl now. It's stuck, whether you like it or not.
Definitely.
Stuck. And I touched around sort of social dysphoria and that feeling of not being referred to appropriately, with whether it's in terms of how you're gendered or apprehended, or the name pronouns. And of course, dysphoria is a big topic. You cover it really so well and so eloquently in the book. And it's such a personal. I think the fundamental thing that I learned from reading that chapter is that it's such a individual thing. We,
Mm-hmm.
of course, there are social elements and there are physical elements, but everybody's experience and interpretation is different. And
Mm-hmm.
you so generously agreed to share your own experience of some of these elements of dysphoria with us. But I'd also love you, if you can, to come through and talk about gender euphoria as well, because I think that needs to be talked about more and celebrated.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, as you said, dysphoria is such a strange animal to describe because it's almost impossible to describe what it feels like. If you haven't experienced it, there's no way to describe it for me. So when I say to people, it's just a feeling of something not fitting and that thing being something that's related to your body. And it's really difficult to come to terms with that and feeling that certain elements of your body make you feel dysphoric or make you feel really bad about yourself. And for me, those were things like having a more masculine body, being perceived as masculine, or the social aspect of it was also really triggering for me in terms of dysphoria. I've always been quite lucky that I've always been quite feminine, so I've always sort of walked the line of androgyny in a way. So when people saw me as feminine, or when people even dressed me as feminine before I came out, that always made me feel really good about myself. And that's sort of when I started realizing, okay, maybe that fits a lot better because it makes me feel really good when people do that. And so I think for me, just the aspect of being seen and being celebrated as such was which what made me feel a lot better about it. And I felt bad about certain parts of my body that I felt were a bit too masculine. And I wasn't allowed to have long hair, for example, when I was younger, and it was always expected that boys cut their hair, and that always made me feel quite bad. So when I was finally able to grow my hair, I just haven't basically cut it ever since. So that was like a part of my dysphoria that was really really important to me, to be able to express myself in that way. And it seems like such a insignificant thing to have long or short hair, but I think for people it's a really important part of their identity, and definitely for me, to be able to do that. And I think just these elements of feeling like you are at home in your own body, I think is a really important thing for me. So when I started my hormone therapy, certain things started changing, and that's when I really started to feel more at ease with who I was. And when I started expressing myself in different ways and dressing in different ways, that was really liberating for me. And I was lucky enough to be able to sort of test it out in different environments where nobody actually knew who I was. So I was able to dress as how I really wanted without anybody knowing who I was trans, and sort of testing it out. And that really did help me. And I had a few friends who knew I was trans, so I used to like go to their house, and I used to then dress up as I wanted. And it became a thing where I was able to explore my identity in a safer space, and eventually sort of come down to how I wanted to be. And to be able to access things like surgeries as well was really important for me, because that was a part of what I needed to feel good in my body. And being able to do that is really, really important. It's a privilege, really, because it isn't possible everywhere in the world. But to have access to that really is, I think, one of the fundamental things that people need, if that's what they want, in their transition, because people are so different and people need different things. But for me, having access, for example, to bottom surgery was really fundamental and an important thing for me to be able to do. And I think once I'd gone through that, and once I had sort of gotten the medical parts of it, I really started to feel a lot better about myself. And that's when I really could start to express myself a bit more and a bit more freely, really. So, it all sort of goes hand in hand. And, you just don't come out and you're absolutely sure of this is who you are and that's how you're going to be for the rest of your life. And, it's a complete process, I think. And you sort of go through that in different times. And it's taken me, many years to sort of find exactly who I am. And I think now I'm very comfortable in who I am and how I express myself. So, it is a journey, and people have to be okay with that, because everybody's different. And, there's no right or wrong way to transition or go through a journey or whatever. Some people take a really short time, other people take a longer time, and that's just how it is. We're all different people. And gender expression is a really complex thing. And I think once you find that element of euphoria, of, somebody using the right name or the right gender, or somebody seeing you as who you really are, it's quite an indescribable feeling, I think. And it's about, you know there's someone you've always felt that you are, and when you finally see that reflected, that is such a powerful and liberating feeling, I think. And I've achieved that through my transition. And I'm really, really quite comfortable with who I am and how I look. And I think, coming to that part of the exact opposite, because I felt really, really quite bad about who I was, but coming and coming to the other side of that, and realizing, I'm actually here. I'm here where I wanted to be, and here's where I imagined I would be, and I'm actually here. That's it's a really powerful feeling, I think, and a liberating one in many ways.
Great. And I think it's so important that you say how transition is so individual, because it really is.
Mm-hmm.
Through our experiences providing NHS services, we try to be as flexible as we can around people's individual journeys, and give people permission to decide that this is their transition path, or this is their transition path, and not feel that they have to sign up to something that isn't them. A lot of people have this misconception around services, that unless you are binary, or that you sign up to the full transition process, so through hormones and onto surgeries, that somehow you're not trans enough. And of course you are. This is a unique experience that only you know what it is, and what it is that you need. And it's also a process for you. So the idea of transition as being a process that evolves with time. And like you said, those small things make such a huge difference. And with every step, you gain that confidence, and you go, yeah, that felt good. Okay, I'm going to try this next. And I really like the idea that you tried things out in a place where you felt safe. So you clearly had a space or a tribe. You found your tribe, and you were able to kind of test out and go, oh, that works for me. Whether that's dressing in a particular way, like you said, growing your hair long, and that resonating with you. And so you're like, yeah, I'll keep that. That's good. And then building on that process. So yeah, I really agree. It is complex, and it's worth just being reassured that nobody's transition is the same. Everybody's is completely unique, and that process and how people experience dysphoria is so different. So thank you for sharing your story, because every story, I think, is really important. And I'd love to move on quite neatly, actually, to this idea of self-care, and finding support and finding your tribe. And a lot of people, when I talk to them, say that they keep a diary, or they write a blog. It's their way of almost processing. It's their way of processing change, because you're moving towards your more authentic self, but there's a history that you leave behind. There are a pattern of elements of yourself that you have to move on from. And I've read some beautiful stories and beautiful blogs of people as they move through their transition process. And I know that you produce amazing films that really kind of touch and reach out to people. So I'd love you to give some kind of practical advice to people out there about kind of maybe blogging or writing as a way of kind of maybe, embracing that element of self-care.
Yeah, I think when we're going through the process and when we're coming out, we often, forget how far we've come, because we're kind of living it every day, and we only see it change in really small increments. But being able to, for example, document those times, just doing something regularly, whether that's daily or weekly or whatever people feel, and then being able to look back on that later on, really shows you how far you've become, because we travel so far, and it's such an interesting process. And I think, when you're able to reflect on it like that, you're actually like, wow, I've actually made it really far in this amount of time. And just imagine where you can be, 2 years from there. If you've made so much progress in that time, you can make so much more in the same time moving forward. So I think that's a really important tool for people sort of documenting it, whether it's writing things down or taking photos or doing videos or whatever it is that they feel. I mean, I know a lot of transmasculine people, for example, record themselves speaking, for example, when they first start tea or before they start tea, they, record their voice. And, you can't really notice the change because it's happening every day. But if you've recorded it and then you look back on it, it's really apparent how things can change in a short space of time. So I think these type of things are really important for us to do self-care and think about, you know, where we've come from and where we're going, I think, because it helps you reflect on that. And I think we have to be patient with ourselves. You know, it's a long journey, and you know, there's things that we can do and we want to do, but you know, it's a journey. You know, it's never going to be, you're never going to go from A to B in a matter of days. You know, it's always going to be a bit more than that. And I think we just have to be kind to ourselves and remember that we're all different and we're all unique, and just because we don't fit into certain boxes, stereotypes, it doesn't mean we're any less valid, I think. And I think, you know, that element of self-care for me is also just doing things that I love, and sometimes just trying to distract myself from these things, because we can get so bogged down into being trans and dysphoria and like all of these things, because it's constantly in the media, right? It's not like we can't forget about it. Everybody's constantly reminding us of that we're trans, or trans people are there. And you know, just being able to step outside of that and saying, I'm not going to respond to any of that, I'm not going to react to what this person's saying, I'm going to do something that I love and I'm going to enjoy it, whether that's hanging out with friends, family, baking a cake, playing video games, like whatever it is that makes you feel happy and makes you feel supported, because we're so much more than trans. You know, trans people are all people with different talents and experiences and lives and careers and families, and you know, whatever it is, you know, being trans is just one part of who we are. And I think we need to remember all of those other parts as well, because that's what makes us the person who we are. And it's really important to tend to that. And I think for me, learning to do that has been a really important part of being, you know, at ease with myself. You know, usually when I feel down or upset, I just play a lot of video games, because I've always done that. That's always something I've always done since I was a child. You know, it's been something that's been with me this whole process, and it's been a really important part of it. So I think being able to tap into those areas is really, really important to figure that out, for sure.
Thank you, Ugla. I've learned so much. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Mhm.
Wise old owl.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.
Mhm.